Say, you better kill me now. Kill me now, you go to jail.
Did you plan to kill your mom?
We dumped it in a big, huge trash can. We said we just want to go to school and act like we just missed the bus.
Your mom's got approximately 60 plus either cuts or stabs. Why weren't you or Taz cut more?
I would definitely give my life for her.
Case 1. The Whitehead Twins. On January 13th, 2010, a 911 dispatcher in Kennesaw, Georgia picked up a call from two hysterical teenage girls saying they'd come home from school to find their mother dead. When officers pulled up to the house, 16-year-old twins Jasmine and Tasmira Whitehead were outside, screaming and sobbing, pointing them toward the door. What waited inside the bathroom was, in the words of the detectives who worked it, one of the most violent scenes they'd ever processed. 34-year-old Nikki Whitehead had been beaten and stabbed so many times, and with such force, that her throat was cut nearly to the point of decapitation. Blood covered the floor, the walls, her clothing. This hadn't been quick. It had been personal. At first, the twins played their roles well, devastated daughters who'd left for school early that morning and come home to a nightmare. They gave tearful interviews to local news, pleaded for the public's help, begged whoever did this to be found. But almost immediately, investigators noticed the story didn't hold together. Both sisters had fresh bite marks and scratches covering their arms, the kind of injuries you'd expect from a violent physical struggle, not from discovering a crime scene. Neighbors said they'd heard yelling and banging from inside the house that morning, well before the time the girls claimed they'd already left for school. Then the forensics came back, and there was no explaining it away. Nikki's blood wasn't confined to the bathroom. It was in both girls' bedrooms. It was on their clothes. It was packed under their fingernails. The two crying teenagers on the front lawn hadn't found a killer. They were the killers. Digging into the family's background gave investigators some context, if not an excuse. Nikki had given birth to the twins at 17 and worked hard to raise them alone. But as they grew older, things turned volatile. She was strict, curfews, discipline, respect, and the girls pushed back on all of it hard enough that police and child services had been called to the house more than once. At one point, the state removed the twins from her custody and placed them with their great-grandmother. By late 2009, the state decided the family should be reunited. Weeks later, Nikki was dead. For years, the sisters stuck to their story, sitting for interviews describing a loving mother and insisting they had no idea who could have done this. Investigators never bought it, and eventually the physical evidence left no other conclusion to reach. In 2014, both girls finally admitted what actually happened. It started like so many arguments before it, over control, but this time it didn't stop. The fight spread through the house. Hair was pulled, nails raked across skin, teeth sank into flesh hard enough to leave marks on all three of them. At some point, knives entered the picture, and the twins admitted to stabbing their mother more than 60 times. Afterward, they dragged her into the bathroom, left her in the tub, cleaned themselves up as best they could, and then went about their day, later standing in front of cameras, crying over a killer they knew was staring back at them in the mirror. In the courtroom, the imagery couldn't have been more jarring. Two small, soft-spoken teenage girls on one side, and crime scene photographs of Nikki's mutilated body on the other. Prosecutors called the twins calculating and manipulative, willing to lie to police, reporters, and the public. The defense argued the household itself was toxic, that Nikki could be violent too, and that what happened was less a plan than an explosion of built-up rage. In the end, the evidence carried the day. Both sisters pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and weapons charges, each receiving 30 years. Now in their late 20s, the Whitehead twins remain in separate Georgia prisons, with no shot at release until they're well into their 40s. A case remembered less for the murder itself than for the performance that followed it. Two identical faces sobbing on camera for a crime they'd already committed. Before we continue, hit subscribe here at Daily Crime Archive. You won't want to miss where some of these stories end up.
Я тебе чувствую. А кто именно ножом убил отца? Я...
Case 2. The Khachaturyan Sisters. In July 2018, police in Moscow responded to a report of a body in an apartment stairwell. 57-year-old Mikhail Khachaturyan, stabbed repeatedly. Investigators quickly learned the killers weren't strangers or intruders. They were his own daughters, 19-year-old Kristina, 18-year-old Angelina, and 17-year-old Maria. The case would go on to split the entire country in two. Mikhail was, by every account that emerged afterward, no ordinary father. The sisters described a household ruled through fear, beatings with belts and cords, hours-long screaming, being locked inside for days at a stretch, treated less like daughters than property. Worse, they alleged sustained sexual abuse, with Maria describing repeated assaults. Neighbors said they'd heard the girls' screams through the walls for years, but complaints to police went nowhere. Mikhail had connections and a reputation for intimidating anyone who challenged him. By July 2018, the sisters said they'd reached their limit. While Mikhail sat in his chair that night, they attacked him with knives and a hammer, brutal, and by their account, the only way out they had left. Afterward, they left his body in the stairwell, called police themselves, and confessed on the spot. "We did it. We couldn't take it anymore." The confession split public opinion instantly. Some saw calculated killers. Others saw three girls who'd finally fought back after years of torment. And the case became a flashpoint in a much larger national conversation about Russia's weak protections for domestic abuse victims. The investigation backed up much of what the sisters described: diaries, messages, friends who recalled bruises and flinching at sudden movement, and even the girl's mother, long separated from Mikhail, confirming his violence. Still, prosecutors pursued full murder charges, each sister facing up to 20 years, arguing they'd had other options besides killing him: running, calling for help, going to police, and that this had been premeditated, not self-defense. The trial turned into a public battleground. Feminist groups rallied outside the courthouse, demanding the sisters' freedom. Others warned that excusing this set a dangerous precedent for justifying violence. It dragged on for years, with the sisters becoming symbols for abuse survivors across the country, their faces circulating in media campaigns far beyond the courtroom. In 2020, the court finally ruled guilty, but with an acknowledgement that they had acted under years of sustained threat. Instead of long prison terms, they received time already served in juvenile detention along with suspended sentences. Today, all three sisters live free, under supervision, still at the center of an unresolved national debate about what a country owes the victims a broken system failed to protect.
No! No! She's gonna run it. Oh, no!
Case 3. The Eriksson twins. On May 17, 2008, two middle-aged Swedish twins ran directly into the path of oncoming traffic on a British motorway. One was hit hard enough that she should not have survived. Moments later, her sister threw herself into traffic too. Police dash cameras caught the entire, almost unbelievable sequence, footage that would later spread across the internet. Their names were Ursula and Sabina Eriksson, and what happened over the following 24 hours remains one of the strangest cases of shared delusion ever documented, ending with a stranger stabbed to death by a woman who appeared to have completely lost touch with reality. Born in Sweden in 1967 into a difficult, crowded household, neither twin had a history of violence, though both had struggled with mental health over the years. By 2008, Ursula was living in the U.S. and Sabina was raising a family in Ireland, and for reasons never fully explained, the two decided to meet up in Liverpool. Almost as soon as they reunited, their behavior turned erratic, as though being back together had triggered something between them. The day before the motorway incident, the sisters boarded a bus toward London, clutching their bags and whispering, refusing to let anyone near them, behavior alarming enough that the driver, suspecting drugs or worse, ordered them off. Stranded, they started walking along the M6 highway, where police spotted them. What followed is on video. As officers tried to talk with them, Ursula suddenly bolted into traffic and was struck by a truck, shattering her legs. Seconds later, Sabina did the same, hit by a car. Somehow, both survived. Instead of lying injured, Sabina sprang back up and fought paramedics and officers, screaming that they were trying to harvest her organs, punching one officer in the face before being restrained by several people at once. Ursula went to the hospital with catastrophic leg injuries. Sabina, despite her behavior, was released the next day, charged only with assaulting an officer, held overnight, and given no psychiatric evaluation. Hours after her release, she was walking the streets of Stoke-on-Trent wearing her sister's jacket. That's when she crossed paths with 49-year-old Glenn Hollinshead, a welder who took pity on a woman who seemed lost and offered her a place to stay for the night. He fed her, gave her shelter, told friends she seemed nervous and off, and the next day, without warning, Sabina grabbed a kitchen knife and stabbed him 5 times. Glenn made it outside before collapsing. Sabina fled, hit herself in the head with a roof tile, then jumped from a 40-foot bridge, and survived that too. When police finally caught up with her, she told them, chillingly, that in Sweden, they say an accident rarely travels alone. In 2009, Sabina was convicted of manslaughter with diminished responsibility. The court accepted she'd been suffering from folie à deux, shared psychosis, a rare condition where 2 closely bonded people come to share the same delusions. She received 5 years. Ursula, still hospitalized when the stabbing happened, was never charged. Ursula eventually recovered and returned to the U.S. Sabina served her sentence and vanished from public view. Glenn Hollinshead's family was left with nothing but the fact that he died for opening his door to a stranger who needed help. Case 4. The DeFrancisco Sisters. In June 2000, Chicago firefighters responding to reports of flames in a vacant lot on the south side found something worse than a fire. A body wrapped in a tarp, shot in the back of the head, and set ablaze in an apparent attempt to destroy the evidence. The killers turned out to be teenage sisters, 19-year-old Regina and 17-year-old Margaret DeFrancisco. Regina had been dating 22-year-old Oscar Velasquez, a relationship friends described as volatile, equal parts attraction and conflict. In June 2000, that conflict turned lethal. The sisters invited Oscar to their family home under the pretense of spending time together. Once he was inside, prosecutors say Margaret shot him in the back of the head while Regina helped wrap the body and clean up the scene. Together, they carried him to a vacant lot and set him on fire, badly disfiguring the remains. For investigators, it started as a mystery. Identifying a burned body is difficult, and it took forensic work and missing persons reports to confirm the victim was Oscar Velasquez. From there, the trail led straight to the DeFrancisco sisters, but by the time detectives came looking, the girls were already gone. They spent nearly 2 years as fugitives, moving under assumed names, until their case was featured on a national television program asking for tips. It worked. In 2002, leads poured in, and both sisters were arrested. At trial, prosecutors described a planned execution. Oscar lured into a trap, shot, wrapped, burned, with both sisters fleeing the state afterward rather than turning themselves in. The defense argued Oscar had been abusive and controlling and that the sisters, especially 17-year-old Margaret, acted out of fear rather than calculation, but the deliberate cover-up undercut that argument. In 2004, both were convicted of first-degree murder. Margaret, as the shooter, received 46 years. Regina, for her role in disposing of the body and evading arrest, received 35. Both remain in Illinois prisons today, set to spend the majority of their adult lives behind bars for a killing carried out not by strangers, but by the girlfriend Oscar trusted and the sister who helped her. If these stories are the kind of deep dives you're here for, that subscribe button is right below. Daily Crime Archive covers a new case like this every week. Case 5, the Papin Sisters. On February 2nd, 1933, in the French city of Le Mans, one of the most studied murders in criminal history took place inside a quiet townhouse. Two live-in servants, sisters Christine and Rya Papin, killed their employer and her adult daughter in an attack so extreme it would go on to inspire decades of plays, books, and psychiatric analysis. Both sisters had grown up in hardship, a violent father, a neglectful mother, time spent in institutions before they found work as domestic servants. By their 20s, both were employed by the Lancelin family in Le Mans, Christine as the cook, Rya as the housemaid, seemingly efficient, quiet, and reliable. But underneath, their bond had become something closer to obsession. Isolated from everyone but each other, with Christine exercising near total control over her younger sister's life. On the afternoon of February 2nd, Madame Lancelin and her adult daughter, Genevieve, returned home from an outing. When Monsieur Lancelin arrived that evening to collect them for dinner, the house was dark and locked, no one answering. He called the police. What officers found inside was almost impossible to process. Both women beaten to death at the top of the stairs, their faces destroyed beyond recognition, their eyes gouged out, their bodies attacked with a hammer, a knife, and a metal pitcher. Upstairs, the sisters were found calm, lying together in their shared bed with the bloodied weapons still in the room. Christine confessed immediately. She said an argument broke out over a household matter, possibly faulty wiring, and she attacked Madame Lancelin in a sudden rage. When Genevieve tried to intervene, Rya joined in. What followed lasted only minutes, but left both victims dead through what investigators called deliberate, repeated brutality rather than a quick killing. The mutilation and gouging pointing to something far beyond a single outburst. The case became a national sensation. Writers and political movements seized on it as proof of class resentment boiling over. Servants finally striking back at the wealthy families who employed them. Others focused on the sisters' isolated, obsessive relationship as evidence of a shared psychiatric break. At trial, Christine, described as intelligent but volatile, took most of the blame, while Rya was painted as quieter and largely following her sister's lead. When the two were separated in custody, Christine reportedly became hysterical, banging her head against the walls, screaming for Rya. In September 1933, Christine was sentenced to death, later commuted to life in prison. Rya received 10 years of hard labor. Christine's mental health collapsed behind bars. She stopped eating, suffered violent episodes, and died in 1937 at 32. Rya was released early and lived out the rest of her life, quietly under a different name, working as a hotel maid until her death in 2001. More than 90 years later, the Papin case remains a foundational example in criminology of folie à deux. Two people so entangled with each other that they lose their grip on the world outside that bond. Case 6, the Shinde-Gavit sisters. Across the 1990s, two sisters in India carried out one of the most disturbing crime sprees the country had ever documented. Renuka Shinde and Shinde-Gavit, over the course of nearly a decade, kidnapped and killed dozens of children. Crime so extreme that in 2001 they became the first women sentenced to death in India since independence. The sisters grew up in Maharashtra in a family already built around crime. Their mother, Janabai, was a career thief who trained her daughters from childhood in pickpocketing and street scams. At some point, the family discovered that children made useful tools. A crying baby was the perfect distraction in a crowded market. A toddler in tow made the women look less suspicious. So Renuka and Seema began kidnapping children to use in their schemes. And when a child became too difficult, too loud, or too likely to expose them, they killed without hesitation. Investigators eventually confirmed at least 42 children kidnapped between 1990 and 1996 with 13 murders confirmed and suspicion of many more. One 3-year-old boy, taken from outside a temple, was beaten to death when he wouldn't stop crying. Another child was thrown from a moving vehicle. The sisters operated with their mother in Janabai and, later, Renuka's husband, treating the children they abducted as entirely disposable. Their spree continued for years, helped along by chaotic cities, weak policing, and the grim reality that missing children from poor families were rarely investigated with urgency. The break came in 1996, when police arrested Ann Janabai on an unrelated kidnapping charge, and under questioning, she gave up enough to connect her daughters to the pattern of disappearances. At trial, prosecutors laid out the sisters' methods in detail, treating children as tools, discarding them the moment they became inconvenient. In 2001, both were convicted of kidnapping and multiple murders and sentenced to death, their crimes classified under India's rarest of the rare, standard reserved for the most extreme cases. Their mother died before the trial concluded. Renuka's husband received a lighter sentence. The death sentence made history. No woman had ever been executed in independent India, and reignited a national debate over capital punishment and gender that continues today. Appeals dragged the case all the way to India's Supreme Court, which upheld the sentences in 2014, calling the killings beyond the reach of rehabilitation. As of today, both sisters remain on death row at Yerwada Jail in Pune, their executions repeatedly delayed amid ongoing arguments over their mental state after decades of confinement. Case 7. The Matthews Twins. In May 2017, Kennesaw, Georgia was shaken by the murder of 17-year-old Cameron Matthews, a high school athlete classmates remembered as friendly and quiet. His killers weren't outsiders. They were his own 15-year-old twin sisters, Leandra and Nyla Matthews, who plotted the attack with 2 teenage friends. The Matthews household had long been marked by dysfunction, constant fighting, general chaos, but nobody expected ordinary sibling tension to end in murder. According to prosecutors, resentment toward Cameron had built until the twins stopped seeing him as their brother and started seeing him as an obstacle. On the night of May 23, 2017, the sisters brought 2 armed friends into the home and waited for Cameron. When he arrived, the 4 of them ambushed him, cornering him, stabbing, and beating him as he tried to fight back. Investigators described a chaotic, sustained assault with blood found across the walls and floor of the home he shared with his sisters. The community shock centered on 2 things: the killer's age, just 15, and the betrayal, a brother killed inside his own home by the sisters who grew up alongside him. Investigators found this wasn't an impulsive fight, but a planned attack, with the twins recruiting friends and arming themselves ahead of time. In court, prosecutors called the sisters the ringleaders of a coordinated conspiracy, not participants in a moment of chaos. The defense pointed to the family's dysfunction and the twins' age, arguing they were shaped by an environment none of them chose. But the clear evidence of planning undercut that framing. By 2019, both twins pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter, armed robbery, and aggravated assault, each sentenced to 30 years. Their 2 friends received comparable sentences. Now in their early 20s, Leandra and Nyla are serving those sentences in Georgia prisons, set to reach middle age before any chance at release. Cameron is remembered by friends as a teenager who never got the future ahead of him, killed not by strangers, but by the 2 people who should have been in his corner. Case 8. Rya and Sakina. Between 1919 and 1921, women began disappearing from the streets of Alexandria, Egypt. No bodies, no evidence, just families searching in vain and a city gripped by fear. When the truth finally surfaced, it was worse than anyone imagined. The missing women had been lured in, robbed, strangled, and buried beneath the floors of houses run by 2 sisters, Rya and Sakina. To their neighbors in Alexandria's Pura Laban district, the sisters looked like ordinary women scraping by. In reality, alongside their husbands and two male accomplices, they were running one of the deadliest killing operations in Egypt's history, preying mainly on women with little social standing. Sex workers, poor wives, market laborers, women unlikely to be missed with urgency. The sisters offered alcohol during a period of prohibition, along with companionship or a safe place to relax. And once a woman was inside, the trap closed. One sister would distract her while the others restrained and strangled her, stripping her of any jewelry before burying the body beneath the dirt floor. For nearly 2 years, the disappearances continued, while police made little progress, hampered by the victims' low social status and a total absence of physical evidence. The break came in late 1920, when a tip led police to search one of the sisters' homes, and beneath the packed dirt floor, they found human remains. Further searches turned up more bodies and recovered jewelry tied to the missing women. By the time the investigation closed, at least 17 murders were confirmed. The 1921 trial drew crowds of journalists and grieving families, with testimony describing screams from inside the houses and women who were never seen again after entering. Prosecutors argued the killings were driven purely by greed, systematic and repeated rather than desperate or impulsive. And with the number of confirmed victims, the defense's arguments about poverty carried little weight. Rya and Sakina, along with their husbands, were sentenced to death by hanging, becoming the first women executed in modern Egypt. Over a century later, their story is still retold across the Arab world in films and stage productions, their names now shorthand for betrayal. Case 9. The Scissor Sisters. On March 30th, 2005, Dubliners were horrified to find plastic bags floating in the Royal Canal. Inside were dismembered limbs and a torso, with more bags recovered over the following days. The head and hands were never found, making identification nearly impossible at first. When the killers were finally revealed, they weren't hardened criminals. They were sisters, Linda and Charlotte Mulhall. The victim was 38-year-old Farah Noor, a Kenyan immigrant with a violent criminal history of his own, including prior convictions for assault and rape. That night, Noor had been drinking with Kathleen Mulhall, the sister's mother, who'd been involved with him romantically. Her daughters joined them at her flat, and all three women were drinking heavily and using cocaine. The night turned volatile fast, with Noor allegedly growing aggressive and threatening toward the sisters. In a sudden burst of violence, Charlotte grabbed a kitchen knife and stabbed him repeatedly in the chest and neck while Linda helped hold him down. Noor died on the floor of the flat. What came next was the part that shocked the country even more than the killing itself. Panicked, the sisters decided to dispose of the body themselves. Using a knife and scissors, they spent hours dismembering him, cutting his arms and legs away and slicing his torso into sections, deliberately removing his head and hands so he could never be identified. The remains went into plastic bags, some dumped in the canal, others left in bins around Dublin. Investigators eventually connected the case through witnesses who'd seen Noor with the Mulhalls that night and forensic evidence tying the flat to the killing. Both sisters were arrested by late 2005, and the press quickly gave them a name that stuck: the Scissor Sisters. In court, the sisters admitted involvement but claimed self-defense against a violent man. Prosecutors dismantled that argument by pointing to the missing head and hands. The deliberate, methodical dismemberment made clear this was calculated disposal, not panic. In 2006, Charlotte was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Linda was convicted of manslaughter and received 15 years. Their mother, Kathleen, received 5 years for helping dispose of the body. Charlotte remains behind bars, serving her life sentence. Linda was released after 12 years. The nickname the press gave them has outlasted almost everything else about the case. 2 sisters, 1 dismembered body, and a head and hands that were never recovered. Case 10. The Gonzalez Sisters. In the hills of Guanajuato, Mexico, through the 1950s and 60s, sisters Delfina and Maria de Jesus Gonzalez ran what looked from the outside like a chain of brothels. In reality, they were running one of the deadliest killing operations in Mexican history, responsible for the deaths of more than 90 young women, making them two of the most prolific female serial killers ever recorded. Their father, Isidro Gonzalez, was a violent local strongman who ruled the household through fear, and the sisters carried that lesson with them into adulthood. By the 1950s, they'd built a network of brothels across Guanajuato and Jalisco, luring in vulnerable young women, runaways, the poor, girls promised legitimate work as housemaids, only to trap them in forced prostitution once inside. Those who resisted were tortured. Those who tried to escape were killed. When women became too old, too sick, or no longer profitable, the sisters had them killed and buried in mass graves on the property. Even paying customers who caused trouble or carried too much money weren't safe from the same fate. For years, local corruption and fear of the sisters kept the operation running. Officials looked the other way, either bribed or intimidated, and missing girls from poor communities rarely triggered any real investigation. The truth came out in 1964, when a woman escaped one of the brothels and went to police with claims that sounded almost too extreme to believe. Investigators followed up anyway, and raids on the properties uncovered mass graves, bodies of women, and, disturbingly, children as young as 12. In total, more than 90 bodies were recovered, with survivor testimony describing systematic starvation, beatings, and executions ordered directly by the sisters. The trial made national headlines, with the press dubbing them Las Poquianchis. In court, the sisters showed little remorse, deflecting blame onto subordinates. But the scale of physical evidence made that impossible to sustain. In 1964, both were convicted on multiple murder counts and sentenced to 40 years, the maximum allowed under Mexican law at the time. A sentence many felt was far too light given the scope of what they'd done. Delfina died in prison in 1968 after a construction accident. Maria served out her sentence and was released in the 1990s, dying in 1998. Their case remains one of the starkest examples in criminal history of industrialized killing carried out not by outsiders or wartime violence, but by two sisters who built an empire on the suffering of the women they trapped. 10 cases, 10 sets of sisters, and in every one, the people who should have been protecting each other, or in some cases protecting their own families, became the reason someone didn't make it home. If one of these stayed with you, tell us which one in the comments, and subscribe to Daily Crime Archive so you don't miss the next deep dive.